streaming to both YouTube and Facebook today?
It is.
Beautiful, beautiful. So those of you joining us who have friends that want to join and are unable to use Zoom, we're both streaming on Facebook if you have a Facebook account, and YouTube if you have a link. So we are on YouTube as Clearwater Baha'is. You can find us online by searching, again, Clearwater Baha'is on YouTube. And we should be among the first people who show up. That being said, Dr. Stockman, how are you doing?
Very well, very well. I'm glad you invited me. I appreciate the offer to speak to your audience. How long have you been doing this?
This has been going on since about the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, when the Baha'i Center had to close. So in place of the Sunday programs where people went to the Baha'i Center, we decided to have something on Zoom, Sunday program, so that people can still deepen on different various subjects of the faith.
Fantastic. Fantastic. This is sort of happening all around the country from what I've been seeing, with a lot of communities broadcasting now over Zoom. And it's really quite an exciting development, I think. In our own area, when we do our devotionals for Northern Indiana, we have sometimes someone from Japan joining us, and people with their friends in Canada or in Montana joining us occasionally. Another member of our local area is coordinating a Ruhi class in Arabic in the Persian Gulf states. So people are really using Zoom quite a lot now. It's very interesting.
It is very interesting indeed. I wanted to ask you, actually, so you participate, and actually you also run a program called the Wilmette Institute. Can you, before I give actual introductions for this event, can you summarize what the Wilmette Institute is to people?
And you can click and open a little box where you can type your comment in the forum, and then everybody receives that by email, maybe once a day, maybe when you write it, depending on how people set up their sessions, set up their subscriptions. So there's an ongoing discussion of the material, and then when there is a weekly Zoom session, it's recorded and put up on our YouTube channel, marked unlisted, so only people in the class can see it. And so we have these lively discussions now. We've got a really interesting course that just started on Hebrew Bible on Thursday, with some really interesting people taking it. The people who've taught the course, one is Joanne Borovica, who just wrote a book about the Bible from a Baha'i perspective. And the other one, Ted Brownstein, has a master's degree in sacred literature about the Old Testament and New Testament. So they really do a good job. So we have, like I said, about 70 of these courses, and people all around the world take them. We just had somebody from Azerbaijan join us for the first time. And I think we've had 127 or 128 countries now. So it's kind of fun. You're interacting with people sometimes from around the world, and discussing books or discussing Baha'i teachings together. And we're now working on getting accredited so that people can take our courses if they're, for example, at a university, and could transfer the course for credit to their bachelor's degree or their master's degree. And that's going to be quite a big task, but we think we can do it another year or two. It's an incredible amount of work.
That sounds amazing. That sounds amazing. Having a Wilmette Institute course count for college, it will definitely encourage a lot more people to join. As you know, in every college, you're going to have a course of this nature. And what better course to hold than, a course that has people actually caring about this initiative to actually teach this subject.
Exactly. No, there's something like 2,000 or 3,000 Baha'is in college in the United States at any particular time. And if we could reach even a quarter of them, it would be really quite exciting. And we also hope to be able to reach out not just to Baha'is, but other of their friends and people just curious about the Baha'i faith who happen to be college students, and encourage them to take our courses also. it looks like we're going to be able to achieve an affiliation status with a prominent group of religious studies schools in California. We should hear in another week or two about that. And if that happens, then we'll be in a position, people would be able to go there in California and get a master's degree in religious studies and take a lot of Baha'i courses. Already we have an arrangement with a theological seminary in Minnesota where people can take our courses. If they go there and get a master's degree there, they can take up to 1/4 of their courses through us. So that's also quite exciting too. So we're slowly building these capacities. And then of course we're doing our own videos and webinars, and we hope to start doing video conferences and do more publishing and all that too. We're a mini university.
That is intriguing, very intriguing to say the least. I wanted to say to everybody here that was just joined us while we were talking, this was about the Wilmette Institute. You can join Wilmette Institute courses online practically any time of the week because they're hosting various courses that may fit your schedule. So the Wilmette Institute, everybody, it's online. If you just search WILMETTE Institute, you should be able to find that. And correct me if I spelled it wrong.
That's correct. No, you spelled it right. Wilmette has got 1 M and 2 T's in it. Yeah.
Beautiful. So I'm going to be giving an introduction for you, Dr. Stockman, if you can give me 1 moment. Okay, here we are. All right, everyone. So today's topic, how the Baha'i Faith came to the United States and the community developed here, which was able to welcome Abdul-Baha in 1912. Now our presenter today, Mr. Robert Stockman, he obtained his master's degree and doctorate. So he's Dr. Robert Stockman in religious studies from Harvard University, where he specialized in history of religion in the United States. He is the author of The Baha'i Faith in America, volumes 1 and 2, which cover Baha'i events in the United States from 1892 to 1900 and 1901 to 1912, respectively. Thornton Chase, the First American Baha'i, Abdul-Baha in America, a volume that reviews Abdul-Baha's 8th-month journey across North America, The Baha'i Faith, a guide for the perplexed, an introductory text, and part of Bloomsbury's Guide for the Perplexed series. Various articles and book reviews on Baha'i history and theology published in a number of journals, including the Journal of Baha'i Studies, Baha'i Studies Review, World Order, Iranian Studies, Nova Religio, and Religion. And numerous encyclopedia articles as well on the Baha'i Faith, including articles on the Baha'i Encyclopedia. Now, Dr. Stockman has lectured on Baha'i topics across the whole United States and in Europe, Russia, Ukraine, Israel, and he's also a frequent contributor to Baha'i panels at the American Academy of Religion. He was an instructor of religious studies at DePaul University in Chicago from 1990 until 2012, and currently teaches religious studies at Indiana University, South Bend. He has been director of the Wilmette Institute, the Baha'i online educational agency, since 2000. He has served on the editorial boards of the Baha'i Encyclopedia Project, Journal of Baha'i Studies, and World Order magazine. He lives with his wife and 2 children in South Bend, Indiana. So with that introduction, I feel it does not do justice, but that is the introduction we have. Dr. Stockman, could you please take it from here? And
Sure.
I imagine today's presentation about how our community, the Baha'i community, was able to prepare itself and welcome Abdul-Baha in 1912, only a decade or so after its first introduction to America. Can you enlighten us, please?
Sure. Yeah, I have a little bit of a slideshow here, and I've got some pictures, but I think what I really would like to do is try to tell stories, because I think that's what's most interesting to people. But I do have a kind of summary about the growth of the Baha'i faith in the US up to 1912 when Abdul-Baha arrived, and then a little bit about Abdul-Baha's visit as well, and then we can do some questions and answers too. I probably should try not to talk too long so people can have time for questions and answers. But I'll start. Is this my first slide? My first slide? No, somehow it jumped. There we go. So the Baha'i Faith came to the United States in 1894. There was a man from originally Lebanon named Ibrahim George Karela. That's how the Americans pronounced his name. The Persians pronounce it Khairullah, and the Arabs pronounce it Kharala, and he was an Arab, so you can take your choice which pronunciation you want to use. But I've actually heard old timers who actually had known him back in the 80s before they had passed along say Karela, so that's how I know that. He is a very interesting man because he went to college, and not very many people born in, he was born in 1847, if I remember right, or 1849. Not many Lebanese people went to college in those days, but the Protestant missionaries from the United States, Presbyterians, went to Beirut, and they opened a college in the 1860s. It's the one that's today called the American University of Beirut. They called it Syrian Protestant College, and there were 5 graduates for that first year, and he was one of the 5. So he was very unusual in that way to be one of the first people to get a Western Protestant education in the Middle East. He went to Egypt, was not a very successful businessman, ran into Persian Baha'is living in Egypt, was intrigued and became a Baha'i. Then in 1892, was actually about the time Baha'u'llah passed, he decided he would go west, and he invited his friend to go west with him. And first, Karela went to Russia and Germany, then eventually came to the United States, trying to sell an invention, which no one was interested in buying. But then he decided to stay and to teach the faith. Now, the problem was that since he spoke Arabic and not Persian, and very few Baha'i books were published even in Persian, when he came to the United States, he was, as we would say, not very deepened. He had a few prayers by Baha'u'llah. He had perhaps read a few tablets by Baha'u'llah in Arabic, did not know a lot about the faith. And so he came to the United States and he began to teach it. And as he taught it and people asked him questions, well, what do you believe about this? What do you believe about that? He kind of filled in the blanks himself. And this produced a rather strange mixture of teachings. So for example, he taught progressive revelation, like, that God has sent a series of prophets. But he taught that after Abraham finished his mission in the Middle East, he went to India, and that his Abrahamism teachings became Brahmanism, which is one of the old words for Hinduism. So he taught that Abraham was the founder of Hinduism, which of course is ridiculous. But nobody knew, and this showed the idea that Hinduism was part of the divine system of religions. But of course, that's true, but the mechanism is not. And this was sort of what Ibrahim Karela did. He sort of created a body with a Baha'i skeleton and non-Baha'i flesh on it, you might say. And this is what he shared with the Americans. But it was very popular. And he started teaching the faith in 1894. 5 people became Baha'is in 1894. By 1899, there were at least 1,500 Baha'is in the US. So you might say he taught it sort of Ruhi style, because he had a series of lessons, rather like the books. And people had to go through these things and graduate. And when they graduated, they received the greatest name. And that was their enrollment process. They learned about Allahu Abha and Ya Baha'u'llah Abha and such. So that got things started. Then in 1900, some Baha'is wanted to go on pilgrimage, and Ibrahim Karela went on pilgrimage with them. The American Baha'is found out that a lot of Karela's teachings weren't correct. And so when they came home, this caused a huge fight, as you might imagine, with Karela insisting that what he was teaching was correct, and the various Americans insisting that they weren't correct. And eventually Abdul-Baha had to send a couple of Persian teachers over to straighten the mess out, and Corella got declared a covenant breaker, and the Baha'is had to stop associating with him. So you can imagine what that did to the 1,500 Baha'is. They were probably down to around 300 or 400 for a while after that, because it was really a real shocker. Baha'u'llah produced a vast amount of text, 15,000 tablets and books. By the way, the total amount of words the World Center says is almost 7 million words. We have about 5% in English now. So Corella couldn't read most of that stuff and was really kind of stuck, inventing his own teachings and then not having the humility to do anything about the confusion. A couple of pictures for you. Here's Corella on the left, looking quite distinguished. This is a picture about what he looked like when he arrived in the US. This, I think, is an 1890, probably 1897, 1898 picture of him. He was at that point in his mid 40s, I suppose. On the right, we have a picture of Thornton Chase, the first American Baha'i, and that is really kind of a title Abdul-Baha gave him. He was among the first 5, but of those first 5, at least 3 of them did not remain Baha'is as a result of the crisis that happened over Corella after he returned from pilgrimage. Thornton Chase is himself a fascinating character. He was born in Springfield, Massachusetts in 1847. His father was a very active Northern Baptist. He was raised Baptist. His mother died when he was 17 days old, and when his father remarried, Thornton and his stepmother did not get along. Thornton's father and stepmother adopted a bunch of girls and favored them over Thornton, it would seem. And so he was sent off to live with some other people at different times, and actually went to, well, I wouldn't say didn't go to high school. There was no high school in those days, but he was tutored so he was ready to go to college. Applied to college and was accepted at age 16, which is not unusual, but then changed his mind and lied about his age, said he was 18, and went down to Philadelphia and got training to be a white officer of a black infantry unit. Was commissioned as an officer when he was still, I think, 17, and ended up being at first 3rd in command of 100 black men fighting in South Carolina during the Civil War for the Union Army. By the end of the war, he was captain of his own unit, which was these units of 100 men had a captain and 1st and 2nd lieutenants. And then he went through a very difficult time after the war, not sure what he wanted to do, married and divorced, had 2 daughters, moved to California eventually, and then became a Baha'i in in Chicago when he was, I think he was 47 years old. He became a Baha'i in Chicago in 1894. So he was an insurance salesman at that point. So but he was a mystic, and he was a solid, steadfast, reliable Baha'i who was constantly trying to convince Corella not to break the covenant, trying to keep the Baha'is loyal to Abdul-Baha, even though he himself had not at that point met Abdul-Baha. He was a very important figure for the development of the American Baha'i community. He was the one who said to the Chicago Baha'is, once they had an organized governing body, the House of Spirituality, which he was on, he said, we must remind the Baha'is about the holy days. We have to send postcards to all the Baha'i communities around the country telling them about Nowruz, about Rezvan, about all these different holy days. And the Baha'is in the US began to observe these holy days partly because of him. He was one who fasted. He abstained from alcohol. So he knew these teachings and was quite steadfast in following them. A couple of more pictures. On the left, we have Lua Getzinger, whom I think most people have heard about her as well. My daughter is named for her. Lua Getzinger, whom Abdul-Baha called the Flame, became a Baha'i in Chicago in 1897 or 98. I think it was 97. She married Edward Getzinger, and she became one of the most devoted traveling teachers for the faith. She and her husband, Edward, were among the members of that first pilgrimage. They were the ones that attempted to correct Ibrahim Kurella's teachings, which were incorrect. Unfortunately, Edward and Ibrahim Kurella got into a real ego tussle, and that complicated matters quite a bit. She was an incredible Baha'i, and of course there have been several books written about her. Corinne True on the right is the woman who really, she devoted her life to building the temple. She's the one who, when she heard that the Chicago Baha'is had decided that they wanted to build a temple, she wasn't on the House of Spirituality because only men were on the House of Spirituality at that time. So the Women's Auxiliary took up the cause of getting that temple built. She's the one who ran all over the Chicago area looking for sites. And she's the one, she and her friends were the ones who chose the site up in Wilmette. They sort of dedicated it, consecrated it with pouring some oil on stones and saying prayers. They had a little ceremony around I think it's 1907. The first organization in the United States that was created for building the temple was actually in 1907, 2 years before the first convention. And that 1907 meeting was held in Corinne True's house. So she was quite remarkable, and she lived to be 100 years old and passed away in 1960. So she saw the whole history of the faith and the building of the temple all the way through to the end. So some really amazing, amazing women. And in many ways, the women built the American Baha'i community. It's, I think, important to note. So Kurella's group at first had a couple hundred members, but he was not a very reliable leader. It shrank down to a handful, and the group died out completely by the 1940s. They called themselves Bahaists, and the Baha'is stopped associating with the Bahaists, and the Bahaists just basically faded away. The mainstream group, if you want to call it that, soon was back to about 1,500 members. And as I said, between 1900, when the covenant breaking episode happened in 1912, we got 12 years. During that time, they really did a lot. They published, I think I counted 70 or 80 books and pamphlets. They began to observe feasts every 19 days, though they didn't, I think they probably kept to their Sunday services and made them a little more important because they were regular and they were on a day. People, of course, people in those days often didn't work 40 hours a week. They often worked much longer hours. So it was very hard for people to go to a 19-day rhythmed event, you know. But they held their feasts, they had their holy days. The very first holy day observed in the US, I think, was Nowruz in 1900. Lots of books, and they began to compose hymns. And these hymns were Protestant-style hymns. At first, they would take Protestant hymns and they would Baha'is them, removing references to Jesus, for example. Sometimes the Unitarians had already done that for them, so they were using the Unitarian versions, or they would modify the Unitarian versions. But pretty soon they were writing hymns using the hidden words and prayers of Abdul-Baha and all sorts of things. So this is the beginning of the development of a culture. You have to have a Baha'i culture to strengthen people's identity. And this was very important, that people could sing their own hymns. The diversity situation is interesting. There were, of course, 2 African Americans who became Baha'is in the 1890s. So there was the beginnings of outreach beyond just white people. There were probably 5% of the whites were of Catholic background, maybe a little more, but I don't think it was very high. Of course, the country had fewer Catholics in it those days than it does now, and the Catholics were mostly more recent immigrants and often didn't speak English, so they were less likely to be attracted. There was at least one Jew, so there was some Jewish presence in the community, but it was quite small. There was 1 or 2 Middle Eastern Muslim American immigrants who became Baha'is also, which is kind of intriguing. They actually managed to reach out to some Muslim immigrants, but there were at that point probably only 20 or 30,000 Muslim immigrants in the US. It was a very tiny community. Almost all of them were white Protestant. Some were middle class, some were lower middle class. The lower middle class were more likely to be Scandinavian and German immigrants, you know, first or second generation. The middle class were more likely to be of English or Scottish or something like that background. So they were the little older immigrants and more established. In the East, there were more wealthier Baha'is, and the wealthier Baha'is were often more members of liberal churches like the Episcopal Church. But the Baha'is otherwise were Methodists and Baptists, Congregationalists. They were solid mainstream Protestant people. And some of them had become disaffected from their Protestant roots and had got interested in theosophy and Hindu swamis and such. But most of them weren't. Most of them were attracted because they believed Baha'u'llah was the return of Christ, or that Abdul-Baha was the return of Christ for a while. But they were attracted because of very conservative Protestant reasons. And a friend of mine, by the way, has done a lot of research on the first Buddhists in America. And he once said to me, I would die for some middle-class people to become Buddhists, because all the people who became Buddhists in America were wealthy. The idea of a non-Christian religion coming into the country and attracting middle-class people is very unusual. Middle and lower middle-class people, they just didn't reach that echelon of population. They reached the educated people. So this was very unusual that the faith already was sinking its roots right into, shall we say, mainstream American culture. Some of the interesting changes that happened from 1900 to 1912, when Corella was teaching people through a series of lessons and then had them receive the greatest name, this really defined who was a Baha'i and who wasn't very clearly. When Corella was no longer head of the faith, they were no longer giving the greatest name as a ritual, and it wasn't so clear who was a Baha'i and who wasn't. And the Baha'is began emphasizing biblical prophecy, but also emphasizing what we call the social teachings of the faith, the so-called 12 principles. That became more and more important through the first decade of the 20th century among the Baha'is. And of course, if you want to talk about trying to establish world peace, you can't do it with 1,000 Baha'is in the US. You have to think about how you're going to spread the teachings more widely. So more and more, some Baha'is were thinking, maybe we shouldn't be creating this exclusive community. We should spread out. The Baha'i faith is to leaven the world. It's not a sect. And so there was this whole kind of disagreement among the Baha'is, how much to be Baha'i and how much to share this to everyone else. To some extent, we're going through a similar kind of change with the core activities, with reflection meetings being open to anyone who's involved in the core activities. But now we're doing it, having established the community and having established the core, we can now broaden it out. In those days, the core wasn't clear, and people were saying, do we need a core or not? Should we just simply stop doing our Sunday services and go to Protestant services on Sundays instead? By 1910, 1912, the Baha'is began moving their services from Sunday mornings to like Friday nights and encouraging Baha'is to go to church as well. And this was actually not something Abdul-Baha was encouraging at all, but they didn't kind of figure that out right away. So along comes Abdul-Baha, and I should look at my time here because I don't want to go too long. I should probably speed this up. We have a nice portrait of Abdul-Baha on the right, and on the left, this is a picture of Abdul-Baha in Chicago with actually, those are mostly his Persian people accompanying him, except the far left-hand figure, which is Qudsiya Khanum Ashraf, who was a Persian Baha'i woman going to college in the US. The American Baha'is were paying for her tuition. She was the first Persian Baha'i woman, not just Baha'i, Iranian woman, as far as we know, to come to the United States and get an education. She then went back to Iran, by the way, and served the faith with great devotion all the way up to her passing in the 1970s. Quite a remarkable lady. So a couple pictures of Abdul-Baha here as he's coming to the US. At first when he arrives in April 1912, and phase one, you might say, was him going from Chicago out and coming back. So he spends like, I think it is 7 or 8 days in Chicago. Then he goes to Washington, D.C. and spends 7 or 8 days there. And then he goes to Chicago and spends 7 or 8 days there. So that's his first visit to the 3 biggest communities at that time at least on the East Coast. The Bay Area in San Francisco was big too. And of course, he doesn't get there for quite a while. So then he comes back to Chicago via Cleveland and Pittsburgh, and actually via Washington again. And then he begins this process of going from New York out and coming back, and then New York out, coming back. And that's really what he does for the next couple of months. So he goes to Montclair, New Jersey, comes back. He goes to Boston for a couple of days, and he comes back. He goes to Fanwood, New Jersey, and comes back. He goes down to Philadelphia, and he comes back to New York. And that's his itinerary. He's using New York as his hub. That's true, really, throughout his whole visit. Then he goes on a longer trip when it's getting really hot and humid. Abdul-Baha is beginning to suffer from the weather. He was at this point, he turned 68 in May of 2012. He had tuberculosis as a kid. He had bad rheumatism, so humidity was really hard on him. And they were actually afraid that he would die. Of course, in those days, the word smog didn't exist. But I'm pretty sure the air pollution was the problem in New York City. So they decided to go out to Dublin, New Hampshire. There's a beautiful lake in Dublin, and the wealthy people from New York and Washington all had summer homes around Dublin Lake and went there in the summer, including, by the way, the British Embassy. The entire British Embassy decamped to places along Dublin Lake in the summer. So it was a very wealthy community of people there over the summer, and Abdul-Baha was welcomed by a wealthy Baha'i who had two houses there. She redid her second house and installed running water and electricity and a telephone so that Abdul-Baha would be comfortable. And he spent a couple of weeks there in Dublin, New Hampshire. He started by going to Boston, then went up to Dublin. When he was in Dublin, he finally agreed to go to California. Before then, he kept saying, I can't get there. It would be too difficult. It'll kill me trying to go to California. It's just too far. And one of the members of his party, Amin Farid, or was it Sohrab? Maybe it was Sohrab. He's writing the Baha'is in California and saying, I think we can persuade Abdul-Baha to come to California. You've got to write him and beg him. So he's getting all these California Baha'is to writing Abdul-Baha, begging him to come to California. Secretly, without Abdul-Baha knowing, These gentlemen both became covenant breakers later, and they had their own agenda sometimes. Anyway, Abdul-Baha finally decided to go to California. So he went to Greenacre from Dublin, and then from there, he went to Montreal, then to Buffalo, then to Chicago. We're now getting into September. Maybe it was still, September. Went up to Kenosha, back to Chicago. Then the long trip, which gets him to California October 1st or so. He was on the train, actually, going across Nevada when the news came that Thornton Chase had died in Los Angeles. And that was, I think, September 30th. So he then spends 3 weeks in California, goes down to Los Angeles, visits Thornton Chase's grave, of course, then comes back to Chicago via Colorado, makes a flying visit again to the Baha'is in Denver. He visited them on their way out, visited on the way back. And one of the things that made it much easier for him to do this, by the way, when he was traveling on the East Coast, he kept telling his followers, we are not going to get sleeper cars. It's too much of a luxury. We're just going to sleep in the chairs, in the seats on the train. Then whenever he would get to his destination after spending 24 hours on the train, he'd get to his hotel, check into the hotel, and sleep for half a day. So I think he finally realized he was better off sleeping on the train, so he had more time with the friends. Also, Helen Goodall, who was this wealthy Baha'i in San Francisco, when they all were going down to Los Angeles on the overnight train, she said, I'm getting sleepers for everybody. And so Abdul-Baha discovered the value of sleepers. And so when he went to Colorado, he had a sleeper one of the nights, and then we went from Colorado to Chicago, he had a sleeper the second night. And that way, when he arrived, he was actually able to be active. And he managed the trip quite well, fortunately. Then from Chicago, of course, he went back to Washington one last time to visit the friends there. On his way from Washington to New York, he spent his lunchtime with the Baha'is in Baltimore, was unable to visit with the friends in Philadelphia like he was planned, so they telegraphed ahead and told the friends in Philadelphia, get on the train at this stop, you'll be able to get off at the next stop. And that's what happened. The Philadelphia Baha'is all got on the train and visited with Abdul-Baha between the two stops, from, I guess, the southern end of Philadelphia to the northern end. Then he spent his last 3 weeks in New York, and then back to Europe after that. He was in Europe for, 7 or 8 months, something like that. That's a whole other trip. Let me get something to drink here. He gave a lot of talks. This is rather old information that I have here. 166 talks, 82% of which were in promulgation of universal peace. Since then, I've actually found more information about talks than when I made this slide. A third of them were in homes, and since then I have found even more talks in homes. He gave a certain number of them in hotels. One of the interesting things about Abdul-Baha's visit, at first he stayed in hotels, but there were several problems with staying in hotels. First of all, they couldn't cook their own food, which meant they had to go to restaurants, and they weren't familiar with American food so much. Second of all, it was very difficult for African Americans to visit him in hotels because the hotels didn't want African Americans as patrons or visiting. And it meant that they could not, for example, rent a large space in the hotel and open it to the public because the hotels would not admit African Americans. So Abdul-Baha switched over to renting houses. And when he rented a house, he could have anybody visit him, and he could provide them tea, provide them hospitality, and it also meant that they could cook their own food. So that was much better for everybody. He had an entire itinerary, what's the word I want, an entire group of people traveling with him, with 4 or 5 Persians, several Persians who've been living in the United States traveling with him at different times. The Getzingers traveled with him a lot of the time. Various American Baha'is also that he would add to his group, his team, for a period of time, and then he would send them off to go traveling, teaching, and report to everybody what they had learned. When he was in Chicago on his way to California, there was a young Japanese-American guy named Fujita, who was at that time staying with Mrs. True. He climbed a tree in order to be able to see Abdul-Baha because he was short and he couldn't see over the crowd. Abdul-Baha saw him on the tree and beckoned him down, met with him, and invited Fujita to go with him to California, where the prejudice against Japanese Americans, of course, was the most intense. So in addition to speaking to African Americans in African American churches and at Howard University and in other settings, breaking that color barrier, he also attempted to tackle the racial barrier with Japanese Americans while he was in California. He did speak to a Japanese church at one point in English, Persian being translated in English, being translated in Japanese. So he was really trying to break down these barriers. Various voluntary associations he spoke to. He spoke to people, I think, at 5 settlement houses. Settlement houses were these institutions to help people who were immigrants or women to acquire skills, acquire language, English if they were immigrants, so that they could get better jobs. So they were very important social service agencies. He spoke to mainline Protestant churches. No Catholic churches invited him. No conservative Protestant churches invited him. But some of those mainline churches actually were, I'd say, kind of conservative in some ways. He spoke to theosophical and metaphysical groups of various sorts. The Theosophists were the people who believed in seances and Ouija boards communicating with the ascended Tibetan masters from a previous age. Very interesting people, very interesting ideas. Believe in reincarnation. Abdul-Baha tried to dissuade them of that. In some cases, he spoke in Baha'i facilities, rented halls that the Baha'is were using anyway. He spoke at 5 universities because I don't have listed here New York University. Actually, he also spoke at Columbia. So come to think it was 6. So this is a little outdated. 2 synagogues, actually it was 3 synagogues he spoke at. One in Minnesota, one in Washington, one in California, one in San Francisco. I calculate about 90,000 people heard him speak. Thousands more met him personally because he would meet in small groups or individuals. There would be long, long lines of people wanting to meet him. Every day, he'd be up at 6 a.m. and he'd be going from 6 a.m. until midnight, sometimes until 1 or 2 in the morning, constantly meeting people, talking to people, sometimes groups, sometimes individuals. In his houses, he usually gave an afternoon talk, and then in the evening, he would go give a talk at a person's house or give a talk to a group of people. It was not at all unusual when he was in California to give 4 talks a day. And this man was 67 years old, no, 68 years old at that time. He was exhausted. And many of the younger people said, we can't keep up with him. We cannot handle the stress. Hundreds of newspaper articles. I'm not sure what the current total is. Millions of people would have heard about him. Of the 70 million people in the US, you'd think 50 or 60 million of them would have at least seen the name in newspapers. So very, very widely available, because what people would do in those days, let's say you operate a little newspaper in Montana, you would subscribe to, say, a couple of newspapers on the East Coast. They would come in the mail, and when you found an article you liked, you'd say, oh, I like that one, I'll reprint it in my newspaper. Nowadays, that's a violation of copyright, but that was all right in those days. So newspaper articles would get repeated in other newspapers and edited, and new things added or things cut out. And so it's weird. A newspaper article might appear, for example, in Washington, D.C., and then reappear in Singapore 2 weeks later, because that's the way it worked. Almost every active Baha'i in the U.S. met Abdul-Baha. Most of them were profoundly affected, especially the children of the Baha'is. When they were later asked, well, what year did you become a Baha'i? Many of them would say, oh, I became a Baha'i in 1912. Maybe I was 5, maybe they were 10. But that was the year when they considered themselves to have become Baha'is. Not a huge number of new people became Baha'is. I calculate maybe 100 people. Abdul-Baha had a huge impact on a lot of people, but it was not necessarily something that caused them to become Baha'is. One of Juliet Thompson's closest friends in New York met Abdul-Baha repeatedly, and she would be moved to tears whenever she spoke about Abdul-Baha the rest of her life, but she never thought of herself as a Baha'i. So this shows you how people could be moved and affected, but then just not quite be willing to make that next step. Something that happens today too, of course. Many Baha'is, of course, devoted their lives to the faith as a result of meeting Abdul-Baha. People picked up and moved to other places in the United States, to Canada, all around the world. The American Baha'i community was very active in establishing the Baha'i faith in New Zealand, Australia, Japan, Korea, Alaska. American Baha'is went up there. So there was really quite a wave of people who went out from the United States subsequently and taught the faith, especially after the tablets of the Divine Plan were released in 1918 and 1919. Martha Root picked up from the 1919 National Convention in New York. Before it was even finished, she left to arrange her affairs so she'd go to South America, and she traveled all the way down the east coast of South America, took a mule over the Andes to Chile, and then up the west coast of South America, and then through the Panama Canal to Cuba and home. I think it took her about a year, and that was her first great trip. And so this is how people were moved by Abdul-Baha, affected by his visit. Abdul-Baha, in his public talks, did not emphasize the Baha'i distinctives, fasting, prayer, obligatory prayer, feasts, holy days, organization. He did speak about the covenant very strongly, and he spoke about the house of justice occasionally, and he strongly emphasized teaching the faith so that to the Baha'is so that they would share it with other people. So this was the thing that really excited them. And he did say some very more internal things to the Baha'is that didn't appear in Promulgation of Universal Peace. If you read Mahmud's diary, you get a sense of what he was saying to the Baha'is, for example. I think two of the things that are most important about that is that in June, he, as Lua Getzinger says, he let down the veils so that Juliet Thompson and Lua could see his spiritual greatness. It's like a spiritual event that they had, which made them realize who Abdul-Baha was. A similar thing happened in Oakland, California in October. An event at a feast or at a Baha'is only gathering where the Baha'is became aware of Abdul-Baha's spiritual station not just by, orally, but by experiencing it. And these are the kinds of things that really moved people to dedicating their lives to the faith. Abdul-Baha strongly emphasized social teachings, of course, equality of men and women. The issue of race, of course, is probably the most important thing that he emphasized. He spoke when he was in Washington, D.C., about half of his audience in the different places he spoke were African Americans. He spoke to the mother church there of the AME, the African Methodist Episcopal denomination in Washington, to a crowd of probably over 1,000 people. He spoke at Howard University also. He spoke at several interracial gatherings in people's homes. There was not just the Gregory's, but there was another interracial couple also in the Baha'i community in Washington, D.C. And in fact, probably the love story between Louis Gregory and Louise is the best example of what Abdul-Baha accomplished. They both met Abdul-Baha when they went on pilgrimage in 1910, I think it was. And Abdul-Baha I remember 1911, Abdul-Baha saw a spark between them. And he wrote Louise when she was back in England and said, "Come to America with me." She actually took the train down to Naples and got on the boat in Naples, where Abdul-Baha's boat had stopped on its way to America. And once in America, he began to encourage her and Louis Gregory to get to know each other. And finally, she asked him right out, "Is this what you have in mind?" He said, "Yes, it would please me greatly if the two of you would get married." And then later that day, in a meeting arranged with Louis Gregory, the topic also came up. And afterwards, Louis Gregory apparently walked out into the streets of Chicago and walked for hours thinking about this desire of the master. You can imagine how he would feel, a black man in a society which was hanging black men for getting out of their place, for even looking at white women. And here it was, the master wished that he consider the idea of marrying this white woman. That was about May 1st. They got married on September 30th. I think it was about September 30th, about late September. And so they decided to get married, and this was a real shocker for the American Baha'is. It's one thing to talk about the oneness of humanity. It's another thing to have an interracial couple. A lot of Baha'is said, we're not ready for this. No one's ready for this. This is too much for people. It's too much of a shock. Yes, we believe in the oneness of humanity, but not like this, not yet. And so by encouraging that interracial marriage, Abdul-Baha forced the American Baha'is to think very seriously about what they believed and what their commitments to it were. And this was a major event in the growth of the faith in America and in the deepening of the Baha'i community, really. He also had the Chicago, New York Baha'i governing bodies reorganized and reelected. Of course, he announced himself as the center of the covenant, as I mentioned already. Well, that's pretty much it. That's my little slideshow. And maybe I can stop sharing my screen and see if people have comments and questions. Let's see if I can stop sharing. Here we are. So, do anyone have any questions they want to ask or anything like that?
So while people are asking their questions, there is something that Jeremiah rightfully brought to my attention, which I know you had a large part in as well, the centenary.baha'i.us website about Abdul-Baha's travels in America. So for those who want to have more detailed information of Abdul-Baha's journey, his travels to America, please be sure to visit this website. It's Centenary, CENTENARY dot Baha'i, BAHAI .US. Centenary.Baha'i.us. And on that website, you'll see a lot of information about Abdul-Baha's journey, which will help you get more information, not just what you've heard in this video, which has been very expensive as it is.
One of the things, there's a Baha'i in Canada who did a day-by-day blog of Abdul-Baha's travel across North America. And that's still up too. I think it's a different website than that one, but it's fascinating because he has a report or has a story about what Abdul-Baha every single day. And of course, he was doing it as that day was the 100th anniversary of that day, you know, so it was very nice. Every day you could follow what Abdul-Baha had done that very day 100 years earlier. And we're reworking that and expanding on it. There's also been a movie done, of course, on Abdul-Baha's visit called Luminous Journey by Ann Perry. And it's really quite a moving 2-hour movie about Abdul-Baha's visit to America.
So the website about the journey is 239days.com. Is that the one?
I think so. That sounds right.
It says it's under construction right now. So until it goes back online, it's not going to be available. But it is a website that when it comes back online will be very, very informative. It says it's under construction and that they're doing a major upgrade. So we'll see what that is, I suppose.
Yeah, that's what he told me. He was working on the upgrade. I can't think of the guy's name now. I'm in touch with him about twice a year about it, and he's done some really good work, I'll tell you. And when it was going on, he and I were emailing back and forth like almost every day saying, what do you have for this particular day? Do you know what happened here? And I would write back and say, oh, this is what I've got. What do you have? And so we were like going back and forth. We were having a real problem trying to figure out whether Abdul-Baha had met President Taft or not. Because it turns out Abdul-Baha was invited to the White House. And this was May 10th or something like that. So it was his first big visit to New York, first big visit to Washington, D.C. And so he's there in Washington, D.C. And the Persian attaché, basically the ambassador for Iran, is a Baha'i, Ali Kuli Khan. And Ali Kuli Khan has been able to make good friends with the Turkish ambassador to Washington. And Abdul-Baha, remember, is a Turkish citizen. So he's an Iranian citizen too, obviously. But in order to keep the Ottomans from sending Baha'u'llah and his family back to Iran, Baha'u'llah told everybody to take out Ottoman citizenship back in 1863. So Abdul-Baha was an Ottoman and then Turkish citizen. So the Turkish ambassador liked Abdul-Baha and met him. And of course, Ali Kuli Khan was a Baha'i. So they approached President Taft, and President Taft agreed to meet Abdul-Baha. Then Abdul-Baha shows up at the White House and President Taft wasn't there. Turns out that very day, it was a Sunday. And that very day, there was going to be a primary, a Democrat or Republican primary in Massachusetts for who the Republicans should have as their presidential candidate, because 1912 was an election year. And Taft, of course, was the Republican president of the United States. But Teddy Roosevelt, who had been president of the United States when Taft was his vice president, didn't like Taft anymore and said, I want to be president again. So Teddy Roosevelt was running against Taft, and this was the very first primary that had ever happened in the United States, I think. And so Taft decided he'd better get on the train and go up to Boston and campaign. So Abdul-Baha shows up at the White House and Taft isn't there. So these are the kinds of little details that we had to figure out with various sources. It was really a lot of fun to research these things.
It's a lot of wrinkles to history, indeed. We have a question from Alex Carlberg. So Alex's question is, would you share the circumstances that led up to, would you share the circumstances that led Alex, can you ask your question?
Just turn on your microphone.
I think he turned it on. Cool.
Yeah. Don't hear anything yet, though.
Me?
We hear you.
There you are.
Sorry about that. I was asking about, Robert, if you would share some of the circumstances that led to making the audio recording of Abdul-Baha chanting.
Oh, well, actually, there's also a movie. I should share the circumstances of that, too. The audio recording was made during the first pilgrimage. The Getzingers brought with them a phonograph, I guess you could call it. You know, the way those things worked in those days, it was a wax cylinder recording. So you had this gigantic megaphone opening, and someone would sing or chant or talk straight into the megaphone, and the vibration would go onto the needle, which would cause the needle to vibrate on the wax cylinder, and that would scratch the wax cylinder with the vibrations, which then you could play back. In those days, there was no electricity used in these machines. And in fact, Thomas Alva Edison, when he first invented the phonograph, he had a recording studio over in New Jersey, which had a big room, and it had a megaphone that was like 12 feet in diameter or something, or 8 feet in diameter. So the sound would go right straight from there, straight down onto the needle, and he could even put like a whole band in there. So that's how it was recorded. They recorded several wax cylinders, 3 or 4 or 5 of them, 2 or 3 of them anyway, of Abdul-Baha chanting. And those wax cylinders still existed in the Los Angeles Baha'i Archives in the 1980s or 1990s. The recording had actually been released, and maybe it was produced as a wax cylinder and was available for people to buy, like in 1910, 1912. But then not afterwards. So the original wax cylinders were then recovered, and one of them was broken, I think, but they were able to extract the sound off of them with modern techniques in the 90s. The movie is another interesting story. This was in, I think, June 1912 in New York, in the backyard of Howard McNutt's house. A newsreel newsreel team came to film Abdul-Baha. And in those days, of course, in 1912, there were no talkies. All they could do is record the video. And that was the old-fashioned kind of camera where they had to crank it in order to keep the film going forward. So there was, again, these are not electrical devices at all. So it was a mechanical device. As you cranked it, the film would move through and the pictures would be taken. And that's why in the early days, sometimes these films are very jerky, because they weren't like a standard number of frames per second. Sometimes people managed 15 frames per second or 25 frames per second. It wasn't standardized because you crank faster or slower, you know. And so you can see a very nice little movie of Abdul-Baha in the backyard of Howard McNutt's house. And it's interesting because you can see him pacing back and forth, and he's got his prayer beads in his hand, and he's doing this with his prayer beads, you know, he's kind of fingering them, and you can see his mouth moving. This is Abdul-Baha giving a talk. And I've often read accounts of Abdul-Baha speaking, and they always would say he would move, he would stand, he would walk, and he would finger his prayer beads as he spoke. So if you want to know what it was like to see Abdul-Baha speak, if you watch that movie, you can actually get a sense of what it was like to hear Abdul-Baha. Now, we don't know what he was speaking about because there was no audio. But that's kind of interesting, I think. What else? What else?
Well, Alex had another part to his question, Alex Karlberg. His question part 2, I can read it if he doesn't say it. You mentioned that Baha'u'llah revealed 7 million words. Do we know the number of words associated with Abdul-Baha's ministry?
Yes, the House of Justice released some statistics in a letter to somebody in, when was that? Maybe 2010 or 2011. That's probably needs to be updated since then. But in that letter, they said that Baha'u'llah had revealed over 6 million words. The number of almost 7 million is something I just saw by email from somebody recently. So apparently they've been updating that number. Abdul-Baha, over 5 million. Shoghi Effendi, over 5 million. and the Bab over 5 million. And the number of tablets, with Baha'u'llah, it's like 15,000, if I remember right. With Abdul-Baha, it's more like 18,000. With Shoghi Effendi, it's 30,000 letters. And with the Bab, it's about 1,500 authenticated texts. The Bab wrote a lot of long works because he didn't have a lot of correspondence and he was in prison a long time by himself. Baha'u'llah mostly wrote, and Abdul-Baha and Shoghi Effendi mostly wrote short things, with a few exceptions. The Igan is probably the longest thing we have, well, certainly the longest thing we have in English. The Kitab-i-Badi is his longest book, and we don't have that in English because it was mostly a polemic against the Babis who didn't accept him and continued to follow Mirza Yahya. So it's really not terribly useful for us. But those are the statistics, and it's, when you think about it, it's mind-blowing. We don't just have a Baha'i, we have a Baha'i database, a scripture database, you know, it's immense.
That's intriguing. Thank you for the answer to that question. There is a question from Alex Boyson from Norway, and I want to read you his question right now. His question is, could you share any thoughts you might have about what made Abdul-Baha emphasize so strongly the unity of the races, given the circumstances? And he goes on to ask, it seems very, he seems irrational that he should take such an extreme view relative to the prevailing culture and norms of the time towards it being race unity, given that the revelation of Baha'u'llah generally was spread gradually, its principles being introduced incrementally according to the receptivity of the people?
That's an interesting question. Well, first of all, Louis Gregory had gone on pilgrimage in 1911 or 1910, and Abdul-Baha had asked him extensively about the situation of Blacks in the United States. So Abdul-Baha was very aware when he arrived, before he arrived, of the situation. And Alex, it's good to see you. I've seen your picture in other places, that seems to me, and you've been in Wilmette Institute courses, so it's sort of nice to see your face. But I think basically the problem Abdul-Baha had was the American Baha'i community was living in a segregated society, and it was a violation of Baha'i principles for Baha'i meetings to be segregated. So that, I think, is the fundamental challenge the American Baha'is had in those days. It was simply incompatible with the teachings to do whites only and blacks only meetings. So that's separate, but not equal. And that was not, I think, acceptable. So Abdul-Baha, when Abdul-Baha spoke about race unity to white audiences, he spoke about it in a theoretical way that did not particularly shock them. And I'll give you an example. When he was in Boston, he spoke to the Unitarians. There's a Unitarian National Annual Unitarian Convention. They invited him to speak. He spoke to the Unitarian Convention. 2 days later, he spoke to the Free Religious Association Convention, which was also in Boston, because many of the Unitarian ministers were also members of the Free Religious Association. So these were overlapping groups. The Free Religious Association was sort of almost more post-Christian than the Unitarians. When Abdul-Baha was introduced to the Free Religious Association, the host said this. He said, you know, Abdul-Baha spoke to the Unitarians 2 days ago, and I was walking across Boston Common with a friend of mine who was there, hearing Abdul-Baha speak to the Unitarians, and he said, you know, he didn't tell us anything new. He didn't teach us anything we didn't already believe. And then the host goes on and say, but isn't that marvelous that a man from Persia would believe the same thing as the Unitarians? So clearly, it hadn't sunk in. Those two people who were speaking on Boston Common would not have encouraged their son to date the black maid who was cleaning their house, because that was the relationship that was going on in the United States at the time. Abdul-Baha may have been saying those nice things to the whites, He was much more frank when he was meeting with blacks. He met with all of the black servants in Dublin, New Hampshire. Where? In a boathouse, because none of the white people would let him meet with them in their big salons. So they had a boathouse on the shore of Lake Dublin, and they cleared out the boats. And on Sunday, when the black servants had the day off, he met with 20 or 30 black servants on the shores of Lake Dublin. And by the way, all those rich white houses that Abdul-Baha was staying in, that Mrs. Parsons owned, they don't exist anymore. But that boathouse still exists. At least it did as of 2012. Figure that out. Why does the boathouse survives and the houses don't? But at any rate, there he told them about the impending marriage of the Gregorys and how important that was. But he did not tell the white audiences about the importance of interracial marriage. So that maybe answers your question a bit, Alex.
Thank you so much, Drew. Thank you.
It's very interesting. When I actually tried to go visit some places that Abdul-Baha had been, and this was when I visited Chicago, I think it was called Hotel Plaza. We visited the site where it was, but you know, the places that he spoke at, they no longer exist. It's intriguing that you know, the ravages of time that a boathouse would survive that. Those places generally go first, right?
Yeah, well, there were two inns Abdul-Baha stayed in Dublin, and the Baha'is have been able to purchase one of them. I think the other one may not exist, I don't know, but one of those two inns was purchased by an individual and given to the faith. So now the National Spiritual Assembly owns the Dublin Inn. And the house Abdul-Baha stayed in Malden, Massachusetts, which was owned by a Baha'i, she also willed it to the National Spiritual Assembly. And the Baha'is owned that house as well. And the house Abdul-Baha visited in Denver, Colorado, which was then sold, and various individuals who weren't Baha'is owned it. The Baha'is were able to purchase in the 1990s, and they now have that also. They can't really use it as a Baha'i center because the house is so small. It's maybe 25 feet square, and it's got like a living room, a kitchen, and a bedroom and a bathroom. So it's really small. I visited it in 1992, not long after they bought it. But they own it also. The house Abdul-Baha visited in Philadelphia, the Baha'is were recently able to purchase it. Well, maybe not, it's been 10 years maybe now. So they now own that house, which was the house of, I can't think of the family name now. It may come to me eventually, but it's very, very devoted Baha'is. So gradually, some of these houses are being purchased, and Baha'is are aware of a few others that they haven't been able to purchase as well. One of the hotels he stayed in Boston is now a condo complex, so it still exists. So yeah, but the buildings obviously can't last forever.
Yeah, but the ones that do surprise you.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask this question. Now, it's from anonymous because I don't know their name. This question is, did Woodrow Wilson meet Abdul-Baha? And the person notes that Wilson's daughter became a Baha'i. Well, I have a question to add to that. More specifically, as we know, it's a topic with racism making the headlines nowadays, as it should have been before anyway. The subject of Woodrow Wilson being racist and such has come up and so forth, which we know that he did quite a few questionable things too, but as a product of his age, he also was like the rest of them, I suppose. So my question is, did he meet Abdul-Baha? Did Abdul-Baha by chance get to have any contact with Woodrow Wilson?
Not that I know of, no. Abdul-Baha never met Woodrow Wilson, and near as we can tell, Woodrow Wilson did not have a Baha'i daughter. This is a rumor that's been floating around in the Baha'i community, and we've never been able to trace it down to a specific daughter. He had 3 or 4 daughters, one of whom did go to India and became a theosophist or something. So she clearly was interested in non-Christian religions. Woodrow Wilson did have a copy of the Hidden Words, and I think maybe one other book is, and it still exists in his presidential library. Someone in the 1980s, there was a Baha'i named Paul Pearsall, older fellow who lived in northern New Jersey, who devoted like 20 years of his life to determining exactly what Woodrow Wilson knew about the faith. And he wasn't able to find a lot, but he was able to determine that Wilson did have 2 Baha'i books. So clearly someone had given him some literature. So there must have been some kind of contact with the faith. Many people say that the Guardian himself says that the principles of peace at the Versailles Treaty after World War I, Woodrow Wilson's points are very Baha'i-like, and that is true. But then those were also ideas that were floating around in the air, not just from Baha'is, but they were just floating around. Abdul-Baha, for example, when he was in the United States in 1912, he attended the Lake Mohonk, annual Lake Mohonk Peace Conference. Lake Mohonk was a resort up in the Catskill Mountains owned by 2 Quaker brothers. And they had been advocating world peace since the 1890s. And this conference was held every year until World War I ended it. And they were always advocating world peace. And a lot of very prominent people would go, senators and judges and ambassadors and all sorts of people would attend this thing. And Abdul-Baha was there and spoke, I think, twice. And we've actually now found his talk. It was not published in Promulgation of Universal Peace, but it's available. And what did Abdul-Baha say to the Baha'is with him? That they're really just talking and, they're spinning their wheels. They're not really doing anything. Something to that effect. So there were a lot of people talking about world peace and what to do about it. The Revell House, yes, that's correct. Thank you. The Revell House in Philadelphia is the one that was purchased. The Revell daughters were devoted servants of the faith in Haifa under the Guardian, and passed away actually in the 1970s. Their mother was the one who owned the house in Philadelphia in 1912 that Abdul-Baha visited.
Intriguing. So I have another anonymous question sent to me privately, which is about Theodore Roosevelt. So Theodore Roosevelt's daughter was not a Baha'i, or was she a Baha'i?
Never heard of any Roosevelt being a Baha'i. Okay. And whether Abdul-Baha met Theodore Roosevelt is an interesting question. In God Passes By, the Guardian lists people that Abdul-Baha met, and he lists Mr. Roosevelt, but he does not list the first name, and he lists the first name of everyone else. So the Guardian may have had some information, but he wasn't sure about it. And we've never been able to determine exactly when he would have met Roosevelt. There is one date, which I think may be in a book somewhere saying he met Roosevelt on that particular day. But it turns out on that particular day, Abdul-Baha was in Washington, D.C., but Roosevelt was on Long Island because Roosevelt was campaigning and he's in the newspapers, so we knew where he was. So whether he met Theodore Roosevelt, we don't know.
Intriguing, to say the least. That I also remember hearing, this is my personal question, about J.P. Morgan. He was one of the famous captains of industry, the guy who practically made America, financially speaking. General Electric, a lot of the modern institutions we have today, they're based on J.P. Morgan. So I understand Abdul-Baha almost, but did not meet J.P. Morgan.
I'm trying to remember about that. I think he might have. Yeah, I think that's right. I think he almost, but didn't quite meet him. I think that's right. He did meet Carnegie, but we don't know the day he met Carnegie. It's just mentioned in Mahmoud's diary. I don't think he met J.P. Morgan, who, of course, whose bank merged with Salmon Chase's and is now the Chase Bank all around the United States.
Mm-hmm. And the intriguing part about that, it's where Abdul-Baha met people like Carnegie, and then you have these public libraries made available to all that really caused America to flourish in the days later on, where libraries were not public. The concept of a public library became something because of Carnegie, practically giving a free library to people who would designate land.
Yes. Carnegie himself, of course, was a poor Scottish kid who came to the United States, practically penniless, and became one of the very first billionaires in the United States by modern standards. I don't know if he was worth $1 billion then, but you've got to remember $1900 worth about 20 times as much as $1 today, roughly. So he was a wealthy man, and he was very concerned about giving that money away and not giving it to his kids, because he felt people had to make their own way in the world. And so he, I think starting early, maybe the 1890s or so, maybe 1880s, began to endow, had this trust for funding local public libraries. And he funded thousands of local public libraries in the US and Canada. And many of them are named Carnegie Free Library, in fact, even today. So that was a really big thing that Carnegie did. He received 2 or 3 tablets from Abdul-Baha.
Intriguing, to say the least. There is a question from Alex Boyson, and he asked this question that Abdul-Baha stated the reason he came to America was the Lake Mohonk Peace Conference. What is the background for this statement, and what were the other reasons?
Well, that was one invitation that he had, and that was probably one of the big ones that he had. Before he came to America, of course, he wrote the American Baha'is, and he said that he would only come if they were united. So he was pushing them to become more unified than they were. And this really set them busy thinking, well, what are we going to do? We got to be more united, So they were really thinking about this. Then he sent Ahmad Sohrab ahead of him in 1911, I think it was. So Ahmad Sohrab goes to the United States, and Ahmad Sohrab is sort of like a press agent for Abdul-Baha. So he's got photos of Abdul-Baha, and he's got bios of Abdul-Baha, and he goes around to various places and meets with people to see if he can arrange invitations, and he sends letters to people saying that Abdul-Baha might be coming, would you be interested in inviting him? So it was, in that sense, it was kind of pre-planned, you might say. And so he got an invitation to speak at Lake Mohonk. That was one of his invitations. The main reason he came, obviously, was first of all to deepen the Baha'is and to proclaim the faith. He saw the potential of America. America, remember, had just begun to emerge as a world power. And the thing that I'm sure Abdul-Baha met more than anything else was American missionaries. They were all over the place. And since there were more Americans than, say, Brits or French or Germans, there were 70 million people in the United States, there were a lot more American missionaries around. So Abdul-Baha saw the potential early, and even Baha'u'llah apparently remarked about the potential of America. I'm told I haven't seen that. So Abdul-Baha knew that this was a big, remarkable country with, because of freedom of religion, because of the establishment of a reasonably stable political system and reasonably reliable laws. If you have reliable laws, you can make money, and people can do well. If you have, reasonable expectations for freedom, at least if you're white, you can make something of your life. And that's why millions of immigrants were pouring into the country in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The population of the country was growing. I think, 20% of the population of the United States was born outside the United States at that time. It was a huge fraction of the population was foreign born. So, this was an intriguing, amazing country in that sense. And Abdul-Baha knew that, saw that. He saw the problems. He knew about the race problem, very, very much so. And it was, when you think about it around the world, the American Baha'i community was the largest Baha'i community outside of Iran. Iran had maybe 100,000, 200,000, 300,000 Baha'is, sort of were half Baha'is because there was no definition of membership. It's hard to say how many Baha'is there were there. There were maybe 100 or so in the Ottoman, maybe 200 or 300 in the Ottoman Empire. There were maybe 100 or 200 in India, maybe 100 or 2 in Burma. There were maybe 100 or 200 in Europe, but there was 1,000, 1,500 in the United States already. So this was a big community. It was a community that was already publishing a lot. He would already have been sending American traveling teachers to Iran, to India, and to Burma, and to Ashgabat in Russia. So Americans were traveling, teaching all those places. Americans had established a community in Germany. Many of the people who became Baha'is in Paris originally were Americans. It was not French people becoming Baha'is in Paris in the 1890s. It was Americans, including Horace Holly and May Bowles Maxwell and a lot of other people. So these Americans were intriguing people, and they were clearly capable people, and it was a capable country. And so Abdul-Baha, I think, wanted to come. So he told the Americans, you've got to be united. The American Baha'is, you've got to be united. And he sent Ahmad Sorab ahead to do advanced planning. And then he came.
Thank you so much for that. Now, there's a question from Regina Colston. And if, Regina, you could kindly unmute yourself, we'd be happy to have you ask your question.
Yes. W. Du Bois was famously attributed that the most challenging issue of the 20th century would be racism. And there are rumors that his wife was a Baha'i.
Yes.
And it just made sense to me that being in Nashville, he had encountered the Baha'i Faith.
Yes.
Did he borrow that from the Baha'is?
No, I don't know about his life in his connection with the Baha'is in as much detail as Guy Emerson Mount, who's a Baha'i who now teaches at Auburn in Alabama. He's got a PhD in American something, I'm not sure, race relations probably, from University of Chicago. He's a very, very bright guy. Clearly, W.E.B. Du Bois was aware of the faith. He was possibly influenced by the faith in some ways. He was sympathetic to the faith. Louis Gregory was really hoping that Du Bois would become a Baha'i. Du Bois clearly was impressed by Abdul-Baha in I think it's the May 1912 issue of The Crisis, which is the national magazine that Du Bois published every month. The Crisis came out, and every month he had a man of the month, and usually the man of the month, of course, was an African American who had achieved something that other African Americans should know about. Sometimes you put an entire group of African Americans, like a bunch of people who graduated from a college, up as man of the month. In May 1912, Abdul-Baha was the man of the month. Maybe it was June 1912. So he clearly was impressed by Abdul-Baha. He published an account of Abdul-Baha's talk in Chicago to the 4th annual meeting of the NAACP in Chicago, and published an account of Abdul-Baha's talk to Jane Addams's settlement house, the Adams House. And this was one of the premier settlement houses in the United States that was very much involved in helping people get ahead. And the NAACP partly met there at her settlement house. So he clearly knew about Abdul-Baha. I think Guy Emerson Mount thinks that, when I think it was Advent of Divine Justice came out, in Advent of Divine Justice, Abdul-Baha talks about, I'm sorry, Shoghi, I'm getting distracted by this phone here. Shoghi Effendi talks about how when there's an election, if there's a tie, minority should be favored to be elected. Up to that point, Guy says that Du Bois did not believe in any kind of affirmative action, but was after that came out, and he thinks that Du Bois may have read Advent of Divine Justice, that Du Bois began advocating the idea of a kind of affirmative action. So there's that possible influence on him that Guy has identified. If I have Guy's theory right, I'm trying to remember it right now, exactly what Guy says.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question as well. There is a question that Jeremiah posed, and I found the source in Advent and Divine Justice, speaking of that book, the collection of letters. Jeremiah was asking what the source of this is, and I'm going to read the quote. The quote is, "The community of the organized promoters of the faith of Baha'u'llah in the American continent," and this is the part, "the spiritual descendants of the dawnbreakers of an heroic age who by their death proclaim the birth of that faith, must in turn usher in, not by their death, but through living sacrifice, that promised world order, the shell ordained to enshrine that priceless jewel, the world civilization, of which the faith itself is the sole begetter." So the concept of the spiritual descendants of the dawnbreakers, did that come from Abdul-Baha?
Well, that's a quote from Shoghi Effendi. You can tell from the language,
Yeah.
the long sentences. That's clearly Shoghi Effendi. I
Yeah,
don't know that Abdul-Baha ever mentioned that idea that the American Baha'is were spiritual descendants of the Dawnbreakers, but when he was in the United States, he talked a lot about the Dawnbreakers to the American Baha'is. I know, I can say that.
Mhm.
As far as I know, that phrase probably is something from Shoghi Effendi, but
Okay.
I don't know.
I thought so as well, but it was a question, and I didn't want to block the question on the basis that there's some merit to it. And if
It's a good question.
yeah. So thank you for that question. But that being said, I am actually not seeing any more questions unless someone wants to bring a last minute question. It is almost 12:30, which is our allotted time. I want to first and foremost say to everybody that this video, which is streamed on Facebook and YouTube, you can share this with people online that were not able to join just by sharing the link. Now, if the person doesn't use Facebook, you always have YouTube. So we have the link to YouTube. If you just search Clearwater Baha'is, you'll see the latest video that was published, and then you can share that link from there. Again, the Wilmette Institute, I think it's very apt that for those who joined us later on, we give a quick summary of what the Wilmette Institute is and how people can join your courses.
The thing to do, of course, is to go to wilmetteinstitute.org, which is our public website. And at Wilmette, remember, it's WILMETTE, Wilmette. Wilmette Institute is all one word in the URL. And there you can find information about our videos. We generally do about 2 webinars a month. We have about 6 or 7 courses starting every month. The marriage and family courses generally start on Mondays. The other courses generally start on Thursdays. So about every Thursday we have a course, or sometimes 2 starting, and sometimes on Mondays we have courses starting as well. And the courses typically are about 7 or 8 weeks long. And we have a 1-month grace period for people who want to spend more time and finish up the work. They're non-credit courses. But as I mentioned at the beginning, we're working on credit courses as well, so that if we can become accredited, people could take our courses and transfer that credit back to their universities. So that's ongoing and quite an exciting and ambitious and exhausting task that we're working on right now.
And that would definitely, I feel, assist a lot of Baha'i youth who want to learn about their faith while they're going to school and get it for credit in school. And also, obviously, the people who are curious to know more. It's a great initiative, and thank you so much for being such a trailblazer in this field.
Thank you, John, and thank you to the Clearwater Baha'is for organizing this monthly program. I'm delighted to see everybody, many faces I've seen before, names I recognize, and I'm glad to be of assistance to you all.
With that said, we appreciate your presence here and everyone here, all of your presence. We wish you all a beautiful week ahead. And this will be occurring once more on Sunday, clearwaterbaha'is.org. Just simply visit the Clearwater Baha'is website and find the Zoom link there. Share it with friends. tell them the Zoom link. If you just click on the Zoom icon, it will take you to the meeting, right to the waiting room. And we will be hosting this again Sunday, 11 a.m. Eastern time, same time.